I'll start recording. So welcome to our 7th session of the Knowledge Hub Africa Conversations. KHA is a platform for knowledge sharing among scholars, policymakers, and government agencies and civil society groups from all over the world, working on key challenges that Africans are facing today. KHA engages in conversations, discussions, debates in key areas such as the social, economic, and political dynamics of climate change, natural resource extraction, political economies and ecologies, development-induced displacement and resettlements as they relate to Africa. So today we have our co-host, Professor Kirk Helliker, who is based at the Sociology Department at Rhodes University in South Africa, and he is in conversation with Eddie Symth, who is the director of the Intersocial Consulting based in Ireland. He was the co-chair of the working group on the formulation of the Dublin Declaration on fair and equitable land access. And Eddie has nearly 30 years of experience within the environment and social development sectors in Africa, Europe, South America, and Asia Pacific, working in land access and resettlement planning and implementation, livelihood restoration, community development, and negotiating community agreements. So Eddie and Kirk, the floor is yours.
Well, Eddie, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation on development and displacement. Thank you very much. What we'd like to do, thank you. What we'd like to do is to focus specifically on the Dublin Declaration, which was produced earlier this year, the Dublin Declaration on Fair and Equitable Land Access, short FELA. And this declaration highlights the ongoing global challenges around development, forced displacement, and resettlement. And the declaration indicates that development induced displacement poses risks of human rights violations and impoverishment. But quite interestingly as well, it notes the significance of anthropogenic climate change and the significance of this as well for displacement of people. So I'd like to ask you a series of questions about this declaration. And just the first question pertains to just the context in which this particular document arose and the main purpose of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been working specifically on land issues for the last 20 years across mining, hydropower, infrastructure, and both government and developer-led resettlement. And about 7 years ago, I started a PhD in the University of Groningen with Professor Frank Bankley on how to improve outcomes for people affected by land access on projects. And so I've been doing a deep dive into the literature and discourse around development, forced displacement and resettlement for the last 7 years, and engaging with a wide range of academics and practitioners across the world, both in my work and in engaging and writing academic papers. And
sure.
What we saw was, despite international standards and a lot of focus on human rights, outcomes from these projects are continuing to seriously impoverish affected people. And of course, one argument might be, well, governments or developers are just not implementing the standards as they are. And so perhaps it's just an implementation issue. However, when you look at how the standards are structured, essentially it's a wholly developer or government-led process with nothing really for the affected people, only a very top-down, some might say colonial approach to experts going in and extracting information from communities and writing plans to determine their futures. So the FELA Declaration really developed at the start of last year around a CWAR brief produced by Jessica Milgrom, Asmita Cabra, and Brooke Wilmson, which challenged development force displacement and resettlement and the current prevailing approach to land acquisition and resettlement. And so that started a conversation where I put out an open call on the Forced Out network for people to join our working group to develop a declaration. And 15 of us came together and worked over a period of about 6 months to develop this, including getting feedback from a wide range of stakeholders. So that's sort of the genesis of the declaration.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll go into more specific questions. I'm just wondering, though, in the case of development-induced displacement and resettlement, are there any particular, I'm talking about now globally, any particular hotspots, any particular regions which this type of a problem is particularly pertinent, or also in terms of the type of projects which might lead to displacement, and as well the actors who might be engaged primarily in these forms of displacement through development projects? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, expropriation and land access and resettlement for major projects has occurred in every project, every country in the world, including in Ireland. I'm from Ireland here, but clearly it's more limited in the global north because the idea of taking people's homes and livelihoods and communities away from them for projects is hotly contested in the global north. So most of the projects tend to take place in the global south. Notwithstanding that, there still are many projects which displace people. And the focus is not just on physical resettlement, but also on industrialization of landscapes and impacts on culture. So, for example, in Scandinavia, there's been a number of wind projects which have been hotly contested by indigenous groups. But in relation to hotspots, clearly Africa is a hotspot, and there has been a serious amount of bulldozing of communities termed informal settlements, but many of whom are long-term, some hundreds of years in situ in recent years, and particularly during COVID. And then, so aside from the need for new urban infrastructure impacting informal settlements and urban communities, there are many projects. There's going to be a spike, an increase in mining projects globally and hydropower projects. So we're talking about critical minerals for renewable energy. So on both sides, both to mine the minerals and develop the projects, there's going to be a serious amount of displacement. And the figures are contested. We talk about 10 to 20 million per year, and some people might think that's an astonishing figure. But cumulatively, when you add up all of the resettlement and land access that takes place, for example, in China, for environmental protection measures, for urban development, for hydropower in India, and all across Southeast Asia, and then all across Africa for a wide range of projects, it is cumulative. So the numbers are very, very high. And we're not just talking about physical displacement. We are talking about, in many cases, acquiring land for projects only without moving people.
Okay. So, I mean, the problems arise not simply because of corporate projects, but also because of state projects as well. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think overwhelmingly it's state projects and governments undertaking large-scale movements of communities. For example, in the Horn of Africa, in many massive urban communities in cities in Africa or Southeast Asia, because the rate of urbanization, it is estimated that in the next, I think, 30 years, 2 billion more people will live in informal settlements due to the rates of urbanization all around the world. And given the population in Africa is due over the next 50 years to double, you can imagine the pressure that's going to put on urban areas for more development, forced displacement and resettlement.
Yeah, that sort of relates to the next question I wanted to ask is about in the document or in the declaration, reference is made to escalation, that development-induced displacement is likely to escalate or is escalating. And likewise, the notion of escalation is used with specific reference to anthropogenic climate change displacement as well. Could you just speak about what you mean by escalation and the extent to which this is taking place?
Yeah, I mean, as extreme weather events and particularly flooding happens in urban areas where there has been much influx of peoples to marginal areas. So people move into these cities in their millions, and they occupy land that isn't currently occupied for good reason in many cases, because it's along riverbanks, it's in flood impacted areas. And so with increasing extreme weather events and a pressure for new infrastructure in these areas, which tends to be placed in lower income communities, then there will be more and more displacement. But not only that, there are many island communities, for example, in Asia Pacific, in Central America, in many different places, where the process of resettling whole small islands is starting to be planned, particularly because the risks are just getting too great and it's becoming too precarious for people to continue to live there.
Okay, all right. You mentioned earlier that the problem is a problem. The frameworks themselves, which currently are in existence, and is it simply a question then of implementation when it comes to projects? In the declaration, it does refer to techno-managerial approaches, which are said to be embedded in the current international standards which govern development-induced displacement and resettlement. What are you talking about? Particular standards which are currently in place, and what specifically are your main concerns about them?
Yeah, I mean, there's been an alignment of the standards in the last 20 years, where most of the standards, based on the brilliant work of Michael Chernier originally in drawing attention to these impacts and developed by a whole lot of great scholars, T.R. Scudder, and many of these people really focused on the problems of land acquisition and resettlement. And what developed was, based on Chernier's impoverishment risk and rehabilitation framework, was a clear recognition that there were impacts and that these needed to be, I suppose, they were well predicted and needed to be addressed in advance. And what that led to was an expert-driven approach, where an expert would arrive into a community for a short period of time, engage in meaningful consultation with affected people, develop a plan, and that would be implemented, and resources would be put in place. Now, the challenge with that is that that kind of framework doesn't address the governance issue, and it leaves no real agency for the affected people in the process. And in some ways mimics what Robert Chambers would have talked about in relation to rural development tourism and experts arriving in communities and not really giving them any voice. And this results in poor design of projects, and in the hands of developers or governments who are on a fast track to develop a project to quickly, this leads to a very transactional process. And for example, in the mining industry, if you take a resettlement process, the mining industry hires a consultant who is beholden to the industry because they're paid completely by the industry. They arrive in a community, and essentially, because the mining company is hiring them and develops the terms of reference, they narrow the scope down, the shortest, cheapest job possible. And this process really ignores the whole governance issue in relation to power and context, in relation to planning and resources, in relation to recognition of local knowledge. And our experience, and we've been running a land acquisition and resettlement summer school for the last 10 years in Groningen, is that the only really successful projects are one where affected people have significant agency in both limiting land acquisition and resettlement in the first place, and then designing solutions that fit in with their needs rather than, external experts, often from the global north. And I say this as an expert from the global north. I can see it, it's this guru kind of techno-managerial approach. And people put too much faith in plans without seeing that during implementation, these are handed over to developers that don't have the capacity to actually implement them or the resources.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a huge problem, which, living in South Africa and studying Zimbabwe for a number of years now, it's quite evident that these challenges exist here. I'd like to get into maybe some of the more meatier pieces of the declaration, if I could call it that. I'd just like to make reference to the declaration and give some quotations. Where the declaration raises the issue of a development without displacement option, with the possibility and even likelihood that displacement is not inevitable for development, and that resettlement cannot bring development to displaced people. And then, quite interestingly, the declaration says that there might need to be a fundamental rethink of what development itself actually means or entails. And then the declaration goes on to detail 6 key principles that seem to be designed to guide a development project insofar as that project might lead to displacements. And one of the cross-cutting dimensions of these dimensions, and this relates to what you've just discussed about local agency. One of the cross-cutting dimensions of these principles is that people affected have the right to a no project option. And then additionally, the declaration suggests that in relation to development projects being guided by the principles, there are possible alternative ways of proceeding. For example, resettlement without development, or a moratorium on resettlements. In that context, I just wanted to raise 3 questions with you. First of all, I'm just trying to place the declaration in the context of broader long-term development processes. Is the development without displacement option the ideal? And is FELA, the declaration, is it being positioned as a necessary short-term or medium-term way of trying to minimize the effects of development projects? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we can position really 2 approaches to land access and resettlement. The current standards, which basically say that, if you have the right expertise and the right resources and an approach that consults with affected people, you can develop a plan, and if implemented properly, resettlement will be a development opportunity, and this is how the standards are framed. Now, clearly, with the standards, because of the lack of agency for affected people in the process, and because developers want to cut schedules and governments and budgets, you end up with a process that is damaging and continues to damage and impoverish affected people. So that resettlement with development, in other words, once you use the words resettlement with development, it's always justified and it's never really questioned. And people can say always when it fails, well, it was let down during implementation, we had a brilliant plan. Now, on the other side, we have the CAWR brief, which basically, it's evidence-based. It says the evidence actually is there that the majority of land access restrictions and resettlement on affected peoples is damaging, and calls for a moratorium and calls for, a real questioning of the need for resettlement. However, what we're proposing is a middle way. Clearly, land access restrictions and resettlement will continue around the world, because we do need these projects. And of course, we need to avoid and minimize, but we still have to work through the process. So it's not a short-term solution. It's a long-term approach to to land, and it's a middle way, which recognizes. So if you take the current approach to land acquisition and resettlement, basically you have a community in situ. They've been there for generations, and a developer with their experts arrive in and say, hello, we're going to consult you and write a plan about your future. And you're now actually a risk to us in your own territories, because the way that the ENS standards and ESG are very much a risk-based framework and a risk to the developer. And this positioning the communities as a risk to the development, this imperils the affected people because they are seen as a threat. And this leads to more harassment of communities and human rights defenders, because there isn't a safe space created by governments or developers for example, independently moderated stakeholder forums. And no expertise is required in the standards to be given directly to the affected people to understand the process, to be empowered to participate in the process. So you get a skewed process, which really in many cases is poorly designed. And can I just add that, I mean, it's well known by everyone that, for example, in urban resettlement, in situ solutions are the best solutions. So, in Metro Manila, the World Bank has done excellent work on, empowering affected people themselves to lead projects, developing social housing where people can continue to live in urban areas and access jobs. And it's the same on major resettlement projects in rural areas. And, for example, the work there in Zimbabwe, if you take all of Joshua's valuable work on the Kariba Dam, it showed that, you had two scenarios. You had one where the affected people had more agency on the Zimbabwean side and actually got fishing rights to the dam. And somehow, because of that agency, had a much better outcome than the communities on the Zambian side who were dispersed on poor land and continue to suffer to this day.
Okay. So just I've got a couple more questions about what I read from the declaration. I was just wondering, I mean, has there really been any significant improvements, given all the talk about participatory development and other cliches and terms which are being used to designate a new sort of form of development? Has there really been any significant changes when it comes to displacement because of development projects over the last 2 or 3 decades?
I would say that, at the end of the 1990s, with, for example, the World Commission on Dams and MMSD and the mining industry, there were a number of genuine multi-stakeholder processes which recommended increased agency and decision-making for affected people. And when I started working on mining projects in the early 2000s, there was a lot of hope. And I had moved from the development sector. I had worked for 5 years with communities in rural Africa on development projects, and I could see a lot of that being transferred across into project development. However, with the global financial crisis, in the early 2010s, and a reversal took place. And with the introduction of terms like social license, which really, they say on one side that communities' voices are important, but on the other side, offer no opportunity for people to take part in decision making or be empowered, and standard approaches to social impact assessment. So what you had was, rather than the development approach, which requires ownership and agency of affected people to map out their own futures, we had this transactional impact assessment approach being brought into land acquisition and resettlement, which says that an expert can parachute into a community for a week, and with a local consultant who's generally an environmental consultant who does some socioeconomic data gathering, they can then produce a plan which will be approved by the lenders, by the developers, and handed over to the developer to implement. And this whole process has really stagnated the evolution of good practice in land acquisition, restrictions and resettlement over the last 10 years. So I don't see any real evolution. I mean, there has been some evolution, obviously, in the alignment of the standards, in the development of country standards aligned more with the international standards in certain cases. But the original country frameworks were based on colonial laws, which said that, the colonists were there to develop communities and they knew best. And colonial administrators were coming into communities, developing plans which were often inappropriate. And that's carried over. The same approach is in the standards, this impact assessment approach, which relies on experts and doesn't really give affected people any voice or agency in the process.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned in the declaration resettlement with development. I wasn't too sure what that phrase meant. Do you remember that phrase? I think it mentioned that resettlement with development as an alternative.
Yeah, I think, the standards approach is resettlement with development. It is basically saying that resettlement can always bring development. It's a development opportunity. So it seems very logical. However, it's used always to force through resettlement and not to question it. And what the CAWR brief really says that in many cases, the lack of voice of the affected people is a problem. And for example, I give you a simple example, the Thar Desert region in northern India, massive solar projects blocking off tens of kilometers all across the Thar Desert. You fence people out. So all of the most marginalized communities that use that area for seasonal grazing are fenced out. Bring the communities in, design the project, and you can have, solar farming, agrivoltaic, where actually the solar panels are a little bit more dispersed, put on people's land, they get some income from the panels and they can continue with their livelihoods. It's just a design issue, but the fact that people don't have any decision-making or voice excludes them. It's the same when it comes to urban resettlement. So the solution is seen to, clear these informal settlers or traditional communities in urban areas and move them out of city to cheap land. And time and time again, they are stranded, they move back into the city again. You don't have to give people free housing. You can give them social housing where, they don't get the title to a new apartment just like that. They pay a lower rent, but they do pay a rent and they get security of tenure inside cities. And, it may surprise people, when it comes to countries like Austria or Singapore, the government owns more than 50% of the housing stock because it knows that lower wage earners have to live inside cities because they are really the drivers of urban economies all around the world. And so there has to be a long-term decision. And we see in Morocco, we've seen in Indonesia, projects around cities without slums. And in Ireland, we used to have terrible tenements and slums. And at some point, governments have to handle this through in-city social housing.
Sure. Okay. Just another point, the issue of knowing whether a local community, for instance, is consenting to a project and to possible displacement. I guess that is quite a complicated issue. And one could consent to a plan which has been, in the end, possibly simply imposed upon one. So how does one try to, what type of means or ways can one try to develop or ensure genuine consent amongst people when it comes to development projects?
Yeah, I think the Dublin Declaration on Fair and Equitable Land Access, FELA, that we've talked about, has 6 principles at its heart and 26 recommendations. And the principles are rights and recognition. So recognizing people's local knowledge, and rather than considering them to be, vulnerable or illiterate or impoverished or whatever, and that kind of positioning really says, well, they're not really capable of participating in the process. You have to get rid of that language and look at the value of Indigenous knowledge and the value of the knowledge of every local community, where they live. Who knows the local area better than them? And who knows what's most suitable for them to do in future, rather, other than themselves? Then the second principle is fair procedure. So when you look at the process of developing projects, any fair procedure would recognize the fact that when you land in with this project, affected communities are not going to have the capacity to understand or meaningfully participate in the process without independent expert advice on their side. That's how you generate trust. So you need empowerment and capacity building for communities. And currently, that is not part of the international standards. Even for free, prior and informed consent for Indigenous peoples, there is no absolute right for Indigenous peoples to get resources to build their capacity to empower them. Then we have fair distribution. The standards do not require benefit sharing automatically. So you have these projects that are, foreign developers or governments are coming in and essentially rezoning land for urban development, for industry, for mining, and extracting huge value out of it. But how much of the benefits go to affected people? So we need a fair distribution, not only of benefits, but also of impacts, recognition of impacts. Then we have planning and resources. These projects are being planned by governments and developers without adequate human and financial resources to see the process through. The standards do talk about, the provision of appropriate expertise. This is not properly mapped out in the guidance or in the standards. And when I talk about proper expertise, I don't just mean resettlement consultants on behalf of the government or the developer. How can they be trusted when they are fully in the pay of governments and developers by affected communities? And so when resettlement consultants are paid by the developer, they need to recognize that completely independent and outside experts need to be brought in, even if they're paid by the developer through a mechanism that ensures that they have the independence. And then we have power and context. The IFC has recently produced a draft guidance on contextual risks. And this is a really good step towards recognizing that in many cases, you can have the best plan, but there are many contextual factors, such as weak governance and corruption, conflict, natural resource degradation, severe impoverishment, that mean that the context is not suitable for a successful project to take place and result in protection of the affected people and their development. And finally, remedy and accountability. Recent studies by the complaints mechanism have showed that, well, the communities may have some recourse where lenders are involved in projects, where they can use their recourse mechanisms. But the challenge actually is that at the once the lenders exit, the leverage ends. So when the lenders exit these projects, what remedy and accountability options are available to the communities? And when no lenders are involved, when a mining company goes in without, say, money from the IFC, and there are problems later, what are the remedy and accountability mechanisms? And unfortunately, the standards are not aligned with the UNGPs, which basically recognize that grievance mechanisms, which are wholly developer-led, are not equitable, because you basically, the international standards say that if a government or developer cause you harm, you have to submit a grievance to their grievance mechanism. And in many cases, how are you going to do that if you don't trust the developer? So there needs to be independent recourse to some kind of independent expert or moderator. And, the developers may say, well, you always have the legal route, but poor people don't have the funds to go to the courts. And developers also say, well, there are civil society organizations there to help. However, the civil society plays space is being increasingly narrowed by governments, lobbied by developers, and human rights defenders are being killed in ever-increasing numbers and harassed. In South Africa, through slap suits, through harassment and intimidation. Unfortunately, both communities and civil and human rights defenders are really facing significant threats, and the standards don't offer any protection for them.
Yeah. So, I mean, those principles, they presumably would be applicable as well to climate change-induced challenge as well, right?
Yeah, completely. Because when you look, we talk about fair and equitable land access here, but we're really talking about fair and equitable projects.
Sure.
And all of the same, these principles draw from environmental justice, but they also draw from pragmatic experience of implementing projects, because environmental justice doesn't tend to focus on planning and resources, and it doesn't tend to focus enough on remedy and accountability and, fair distribution.
Yeah.
And people call for human rights approaches. But the challenge in land acquisition and resettlement with a human rights approach is it tends to focus on the absolute minimum right.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you took the absolute minimum right to water and you took the AAQ principles, it would be enough to provide people with water within a 30-minute walk or a certain amount of water. Whereas when we're planning land acquisition and resettlement projects, we want to see people with free access to water right there at their homes or inside their homes. So a focus on human rights can cause problems as well, because, a human rights due diligence is good, but it doesn't necessarily place the right experts there to present the right solutions. And so a lot of funds are spent really on, integrated human rights due diligence processes. But what we really need is a cohort of national experts in all of these countries being trained up. And the challenge there is that, there aren't courses taught in universities on land acquisition and resettlement in Africa. And even social impact assessment has poor traction. And what we really need is, a whole cohort of land acquisition and resettlement practitioners being trained in Africa who have a strong experience and basis in community development to manage these projects with communities. And that's the approach that's needed, not this external expert-led approach from the global north.
So when you sort of gaze across Africa in terms of development projects and displacement, are there particular concerns, particular issues which you think are really coming to the head, so to speak? And I mean, are there any initiatives at national level? I mean, is there any particular country or countries who might in some way be taking the lead or taking a more progressive stance in terms of legislation and policy around developments within the territorial boundaries? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, some of the concerns, there is a big concern at the moment for something called legacy issues. And what we're talking about here is, I've had this conversation with people who are working in Africa where they see a trend of governments going in and bulldozing informal communities or traditional communities in urban areas in advance of applying for funding to the World Bank or international lenders. And it seems to me that there is a sort of an informal message gone out to governments that if they clear these areas, well in advance of applying for funding, that somehow lenders will ignore the actual land acquisition and resettlement responsibilities because, it was done beforehand. The communities are too hard to find. So we have something, called future legacies. You're literally deliberately clearing these areas prior to applying for funds, so that it's seen as a legacy issue, which can't really be addressed. And that is deliberately happening and is affecting hundreds of thousands of people who are being stranded. So I think the lenders really need to look at the messages that are going out to governments around this. In terms of positive developments, in Sierra Leone and Liberia, we had a massive granting of concessions to elites from urban areas and also foreign developers for all kinds of projects. And this got to the extent that I think, up to 30% of the land area of Sierra Leone and Liberia was being given out, and often by traditional leaders who increasingly live in cities and not in their communities. And this led to a new land law in Sierra Leone, which required the consent of local communities for any project with significant land acquisition requirements. So that issue of consent, when we in this Dublin Declaration on Fair and Equitable Land Access ask for community agency, we're not anti-project. We want projects to move forward, but we want them to be designed better, and we want them to be fair and equitable. Can we say that the current standards and laws that are in place in Africa are fair and equitable? And I don't think so. I think they continue to be very top down. And it's not just a problem of foreign developers, it's a problem of local elites capturing the benefits from these projects. And with that, you get increased inequality and a failure to address poverty and exacerbated poverty, and in many cases, conflict as well.
Yeah. Okay, Eddie, thank you so much for this wide-ranging discussion. I'd just like to end, though, with how you'd like, or how you're planning to, and how you are moving forward with the declaration, trying to make it more widely known, engage in perhaps advocacy, and also how our listeners could potentially contribute to what you're trying to do. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is just the start, and we called it the Dublin Declaration on Fair and Equitable Land Access Mark 1. We don't think that this declaration has all the answers or it's some kind of a final process, but it's the start of a conversation about how projects can be developed in a more fair and equitable way. So the declaration itself is on a LinkedIn page called FELA, FELA, and you can go and follow the page and see updates. We have submitted the declaration to a number of lender revisions of their standards, and we know that some of the lenders are benchmarking their standards against the FELA declaration and the recommendations therein. So, we welcome that, and we would ask more lenders. Many of the standards have elements of, so it's not like the standards don't have anything that's fair and equitable, but any one standard doesn't have all the elements of this. For example, the EBRD standard requires negotiated agreements, where these are optional in the IFC standards. So there are many positive elements of the existing standards, but not all of them together. Yeah. And particularly around capacity building and empowerment of communities, fair processes like independently moderated stakeholder forums. And, there is a push towards developing, for example, in free, prior, and informed consent guidance and a sort of a mechanism. But in many cases, this amounts to, something like 3 rounds of consultation, and something that really wouldn't meet the FELA approach in terms of really deliberate capacity building through independent advice. Yeah. So we would say to lenders, say to experts, try and incorporate the FELA principles in your standards and in your work. And then we would say to affected communities and civil society, this offers something for you to point to, and question governments and developers and say, is your process fair and equitable? And do they meet these principles and the recommendations therein? And we believe that we can have projects and continue with development. We are not anti-development. I am an industry consultant. I work on mining projects. I work on hydropower projects. I work on conservation projects, but they are not succeeding in their objectives. And the developers are under a push at the moment. At the World Bank spring meetings, the World Bank president, said bigger and faster. And people are talking again about, breaking a few eggs, and what this actually means is going back, to the 80s and all the time before that, where breaking the eggs was bulldozing communities, damaging communities. And, we can have bigger and faster projects if we involve people in the process, because there is adequate time. These projects take years to develop in any case. Start a conversation with the communities, build their capacity, bring their knowledge into the process, question resettlement, and you can have much better outcomes. So we really need to see a more fair and equitable land access all across the world.
Well, on that note, Eddie, thank you so much for this very stimulating and wide-ranging discussion, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity of meeting you soon. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
And thanks, Kirk, and thanks, Joshua, for organizing this.
Thank you.